Welcome back to Civil Wars. I'm William Spaniel, and this lecture is on applying our theories of information and conflict to the Russia-Georgia War of 2008. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, gee, I don't remember a war between Russia and Georgia in 2008, you're thinking about the wrong Georgia. Not Georgia Peaches, Georgia, the former Soviet Socialist Republic. The brief history is something like this. The Soviet Union falls in 1991, and Georgia declares itself independent. However, two regions within Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, try to declare themselves independent from Georgian rule. Georgia does not respond kindly to this. It fights a war against both of those separatist regions. However, things go badly for Georgia in both cases. Both wars are fairly short and both end in Georgian defeat and de facto independence for those breakaway republics. So what that means is that, say, the United Nations doesn't recognize South Ossetia or Abkhazia as a country. However, Georgia is unable to administer those regions, and those regions have their own governments that do administer those regions, all while Georgia claims that those regions are still a part of Georgian territory. So it's like they're countries, but they just aren't recognized as such. And just to situate ourselves in the world, where are we? Well, to the north is Russia, to the south is Turkey, Georgia is dead center. This is actually a very politically active part of the world right now. So I'm filming this during the Winter Olympics. The Winter Olympics are being held in Sochi in 2014. Sochi is just to the northwest in Russia, slightly off of the map. And slightly on the map, in the northeast part of this map in Russia, is where Chechnya is. Chechnya is in the news because that is a region of Russia that has been in an insurgency for a very long time. And if you've heard about any terrorist threats in Sochi, they're coming from Chechnya, that region of Russia. So it's a very geopolitically active part of the world right now. But the focus of this lecture is on Georgia. So we see in Georgia, in the central part of Georgia to the north, South Ossetia, that pink region is its own de facto country. Doesn't have the actual recognition from, say, the United Nations, but it runs itself. Same thing with Abkhazia in the northwest, that green section of Georgia. So we see large swaths of Georgia not actually controlled by Georgia, but by their own de facto independent countries, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So this is more or less the status quo in 2008 in the lead up to the war between Russia and Georgia. The war itself is very short. So on August 8, Georgia tries to reclaim South Ossetia. It gathers an army and tries to invade the region because, again, Georgia still says, hey, South Ossetia is part of our country. It's our country. We're not even fighting a war against another country. We're fighting a war inside of our country to regain the territory that is actually ours. However, the next day, Russia deploys forces. It shouldn't be surprising that as a small country or a small de facto country like South Ossetia, it can't defend itself. So it has to rely on Russia for its defense, and sure enough, Russia comes to its defense the next day. And over the 2 days after that, Russia and Abkhazia open up a western front in where the Abkhazia part of Georgia is. Doesn't take long for this war to end. There's a ceasefire on August 12th. So the results are as follows. Not very many people actually die in this conflict. So if I'm doing my math right here, I see 278 people dying from battle deaths. I mentioned this at the beginning of this course, that when we track whether a war is counted as a war or not, we look at how many battle deaths there are. Well, there are so few battle deaths because this war didn't last very long that this war would not actually be counted as a war in many of those data sets. There were civilian casualties on both sides, but civilian casualties don't count toward the oftentimes 1,000 minimum battle deaths threshold for a conflict to be counted as a war. Again, though, things are going very badly for Georgia. So Georgia is losing more sections of its country to both Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And in fact, now, as of today, 20% of Georgia is not controlled by Georgia. It's controlled by either Abkhazia or South Ossetia. Now, there's a very simple explanation for what we observed here. First, the initiation of the conflict and also the termination of the conflict. I want to emphasize before we actually get to this that there are many other important facets about this conflict. I'm just focusing on one, information. I'm not saying that the other ones are irrelevant. I just want to focus on one thing right now. Focus on the small things and then expand your horizons from there. Right? So the simple explanation is as follows. Georgia was uncertain about Russian commitment to South Ossetia. So Russia wants to claim that, yes, Russia will come to the defense of South Ossetia if Georgia was to get into a conflict. However, Russia has obvious incentives to lie about that because Russia would like to have South Ossetia be its own autonomous region without having to invest in the cost to defend it. And so as a result, Georgia, not knowing whether Russia was actually going to intervene or not, goes ahead and invades South Ossetia under the belief and under the assumption and under the hope that Russia would not intervene heavily. However, intervention from Russia credibly signaled Russian preferences. So if it's uncertain whether Russia is actually committed to South Ossetia or not, the way that Russia can convey that information credibly is not through simple cheap talk, but rather through costly measures. And costly measures like fighting and having people die actually signals your true preferences that you are going to stand up to the invasion from Georgia in South Ossetia, and you're going to fight back, and you're going to be committed to this conflict. And so war ends very quickly from that point, because if the war started because of uncertainty about Russian commitment, Georgia very quickly learns that Russia is committed. This resolves the information problem. The information problem ceases to exist. The cause for war ceases to exist. And so they terminate conflict because they can now reach a settlement that both sides prefer to war. So that is the very simple version of the Russian-Georgia War. Hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time. Take care.